I love the standing ovation before rather than after. That's a very nice innovation. So, I do not know Thomas. This is the first time I've met him and heard him, but Thomas, I want you to be with me forever now because everything that you just said, I feel like I'm going to be a case study to illustrate what it was you said. So, I work on this issue of gender balance, and very often, I'm talking about it in rooms that look a lot like this. In fact, in our little trio in our exercise with Thomas, I had some reactions. Do you have any idea what these parts of humanity feel like about this topic of gender balance? What's the emotion in these rooms that I spend a lot of time in? Any ideas? What do women think of this whole topic of gender balance? And what did my colleague we were discussing with before express? Gentlemen? Yeah, ladies, come on. Absolutely. Impatience. Oh, God, we've been talking about this for decades. Why isn't it moving faster? Right? Very common sentiment among women. Do you think that these people have the tools to change the issue of gender balance? What do you think is their ability to nudge this topic forward at any level? Yes? These people, the female half of the population, rooms of women that are very often involved in discussing the issue of gender balance. Do you think they have what it takes to shift the balance? They're talking the challenge and the opportunity. They're half of it, absolutely. It's why you need the other half of the population. Who's creating the issue? Who's trying to solve what issue?
Women aren't the challenge. Women aren't the challenge. The challenge we have is that our societies are designed from a masculine perspective. That's not women's problem. That's actually society's problem. And I think where I come from, in New Zealand, we have plenty of examples of how we change our society to reflect a better gender and I would have to say race challenge.
Yep.
To better reflect that. So I don't think that these people are actually the people with the challenge.
These are not the people. So a perfect reframing of the issue, right? Is this a women's issue? How can women solve an issue of gender balance when it's a bigger issue, eventually not created by the women in the room? And how do you get the problem or the issue or the opportunity to be reframed? And is part of our challenge in addressing it the frame we currently have on it, which is almost always discussed in rooms that look like this. And I can't agree with you more that until we get rooms that look more like this one today, we are very unlikely to be able to address the topic. Now, I'm going to try and do exactly what Thomas invited us all to do, is how do you reframe this issue? What would be an alternative perspective to it? And this is my alternate perspective to the issue of gender balance and the opportunity. And I call it the 4 W's. There are big shifts in the world. I'm sure we're going to discuss all 4 of them during the next few days. Web, weather, world, and women. These are the big millennial changes that every business we work with is addressing. The technological revolution, the climate issue, the globalization issue and its reactions, and the rise of women and its impact on the other half of the population. Now, this is not, I would argue, the way this topic is usually framed. How do you think it's usually framed? When you think of gender balance, gender at all, what bucket in your mind does it go into? Huh? Diversity. Yeah, absolutely, diversity. It's a diversity dimension among many. What did I pick up this morning? The FT, not HBR. Diversity leaders. And how do they define their thing? Let me just give you a very typical frame. Conducted, these include, they're trying to devise, promoting all types of diversity. These include gender balance, openness to all forms of sexual orientation, disability, as well as ethnic and social mix. Much more classic, right?
Are women a diversity feature?
What do you think?
They're not.
Are women a diversity dimension? I would argue not. But I would also argue that framing them that way, which is now spreading from the Anglo-Saxon countries to almost every country in the world, is a very effective way of keeping women something they aren't. A small diversity, minority dimension among many, where almost everybody now is so impatient with gender, and men in particular are so tired of, oh my God, this gender fatigue is spreading, that they will continually argue, yes, but diversity is so much more than gender, just gender. And they're right. Diversity is a wonderful, multifaceted thing, and it's got nothing to do with gender balance. So let me take you down this particular frame and perhaps respond by reframing, which I try and do a lot, especially for the impatient women in the room, is my colleague was saying, why is it going so slowly? Why is this taking so much time? And my question was, is it going slow? Or is it going fast? Really fast, so fast it's hard to handle. What do you think? What's the vote in the room? Is gender balance happening fast? Anybody think it's really fast? Yeah? Couple? Is it going slowly? Too slow? Okay, I got a room of impatience. So in human history, just the last, let's say, couple of thousand years, has been a largely male-dominated story. What's changed, I would argue, has come about remarkably quickly, remarkably peacefully, too. This is a very peaceful revolution. But I like to summarize it by saying, okay, our grandmothers got the vote, 1918 in the UK, 1920 in the US, spread across different years. I'm not even going to talk about Switzerland. That was rather recent. Our grandmothers got the vote. Our mothers got the pill, 1960. Our generation, my generation, some of the people in the room here, we got a good education and a good job. And all of that has happened in a century or less. And how fast or slow that is depends on who you are, far more than on what's actually going on. And I would suggest it's a slightly gendered perspective. I think a lot of women think it's going really, really slowly. And I think a lot of men think it's going a little bit too fast. And I always sort of stand back If I'm critical of myself, my sadness in life when I look in the mirror is that I'm a woman arguing about gender balance, which is why I hired a male managing director of my firm, because really, really, really we need men to be engaged and leading on this conversation. But if I look at the 20th century, we really did see the rise of women massively streaming into labor forces, talent pools, consumer power, political roles. And this century, we're starting to see the consequences at multiple levels, with multiple reactions. And I'm going to work through a little bit, what are some of the things that we're seeing? And does it matter? And does it matter how we frame the issue and the opportunity that it offers our countries, companies, and couples, whether we're going to get the best out of what is one of the biggest transformations of our lives? So, I usually work with mostly men, because I work with a lot of leadership teams around the world, and I find they're still very massively male-dominated. I'm lucky if I get 1 or 2 women in an executive team. So I'm talking to a lot of men who have very mixed feelings about this. On the whole, they like to see themselves as fairly progressive, but if you dig a little bit, it's not necessarily as easy or as skilled at understanding what is going on and how much they themselves may need to evolve if they want to lead the issue in their own companies. So I'll talk a bit about, and I think we have, in addressing the whole topic of gender balance, dramatically excluded men from the conversation, from the solution, and from being asked to lead the change. And until we shift and balance the responsibility of gender balance between men and women, we're never going to get it. And the more women drive this topic, the more men will react against it. And believe me, men's reactions to gender balance isn't just being played out in small scales. If you don't think some of the political backlashes and political leaders we are now electing has something to do with the backlash on gender changes, I think you're not seeing the playing field. So country level, let's take a look. One of the big shifts is declining birth rates. The pill was a revolution. It gave people choice on something we've never had choices about. And so what have we seen is all over the world, this isn't a Western story, it's not a Northern story, all over the world, fertility rates have dramatically dropped and continue to do so. Even since just the turn of the century, they've dropped even further. In a lot of countries, they're dropping so far that countries are shrinking. Did you know that there are today 46 countries that are shrinking demographically because they're making no more babies? Is that a good thing? Now that we've got the parallel challenge of climate change, we're starting to learn, because it's being published quite a bit, that the number one climate impact is having children. And so you can also see in that smaller graph that as soon as countries get richer and more educated, there's an exact causality to dropping fertility rates, something that should be celebrated. Unless we're actually not having children that we would like to have, which is increasingly now the challenge. Most couples, if you survey them around the world, or my MBA class at HEC I was teaching, are dreaming of a dual career couple and 2 children. 2 is still the magic dream. And yet, birth rates around the world are dropping well below the 2.1 replacement ratio. Because women are essentially voting with their wombs. What we've done is we've educated women and invited them into the labor force without actually adapting the system in which they're trying to operate. So there aren't very many countries that have really been effective in conciliating work and family issues in a new reality where there are two parents working and they try and balance work with taking care of these kids. The countries that are have different results. But what we're also seeing, and I'm sure you're going to hear about, is the longevity phenomenon. So fewer kids, we're living much longer, and we're not replenishing our demographic pool. So we're moving, and this is just the US, which has been a relatively healthy demographic until recently. We're moving from what Linda Carstensen at Stanford calls pyramids to cubes in terms of demographics, which means we have fewer and fewer young people taking care and running economies that are increasingly dominated by older and older people. Now, these aging society challenges, who's going to be paying for your pensions becomes a question, and who will your children be living with, and will they themselves be able to have the grandchildren and great-grandchildren that you might be yearning for? Not if their countries don't make it a little bit easier. And right now what we're seeing, the US is at a 32-year low in birth rates, just a constant drop. Japan, perhaps as you have been reading much more traditionally, is even more constricted. That country's been shrinking along with Germany, Russia, South Korea for over a decade. Because women in these countries are facing workplaces that won't allow them to balance, and spouses that are very reluctant to pick up some of the balancing issues at home. To your point, well, somebody in our session. What happens when these gender roles at work change? Women get more and more financial power, more and more independence, but do they find the men who are willing to partner with this new form of female? Not so easy. I'll get back to the couple side of things. On the country side, it's absolutely key, as it is on the company side, who's leading these different countries. And you can see that there are two trends going on in parallel. One is the backlash, the macho, dominant, reactionary leadership coming up as part of a very backlash issue back to the way things used to be and the way gender roles used to be. In those countries, it will become increasingly difficult for women to embody their new roles, or men for that matter. And then you see a whole swath of other countries and evolutions. Here I'm featuring Canada and France as two countries that have gender balanced their governments, who make this part of their policy initiatives, who are trying to balance everything from their armies to their health systems. And you can see that there are parts of the economy that are increasingly taken over by women. The IMF, the World Bank, the European Commission are all now led by women, not just any women, women who've really put gender balance as a policy priority. Those regions are going to have a very different approach to leveraging the economic and social opportunity that is gender balancing countries. What about companies? That's a little bit more the focus of some of my work and some of your work. And here I'd say the issue is a bit the same. We've seen women massively move into education. 60% of university graduates today are female. In North America, they're also the majority of master's degrees, just flipped into the majority of doctoral degrees in the US. We're seeing them emerge in ever-increasing numbers in a range of fields. And the question is, are companies able and skilled at managing this inflow of gender-balanced talent? Do they know how to leverage this skill? The other part of the equation, of course, is customers. Do you know who your customers are becoming? And you'd be astonished how many companies I go in who don't necessarily analyze their customers by gender. I was working for a charming German tire company that said, oh, well, tires, we don't have to worry about this gender problem among our customers because only men buy car tires. I hear this in a lot of companies, only men buy car tires, only men buy whiskey, only men buy all kinds of things. Do you know what percentage of, we asked them to test this idea in a country or two. Do you know what percentage of car tires in the UK are now bought by women? Hazard a guess? 70. Not quite, 55%. So when you tell a German car company, entirely run by men, fueled by men, historic, long history, that actually the majority of their customers and purchasing decision makers are women today, what does that change? How does that reframe the issue in their brain? How does that reframe product development, distribution channels, communications, PR and marketing? Does it? And who's going to do it? And do they have the skills and understanding of that customer base to actually serve it? So, one of the curious things about this is how this whole issue is framed in companies. And I'd say, very often, it's framed as a problem. This is a big problem. Oh, it's a terrible problem. We're on the wrong rankings, we don't look good, our executive team is embarrassingly male-dominated, we're getting more pressure from shareholders, governments, regulators, pay gap legislation. Oh, it's a real problem. And the problem looks like this. People are increasingly aware, embarrassed by what we call their gender jaws. Not a very nice term, I agree. But most companies are now recruiting in a very gender-balanced talent pool, 50-50, if not even more women than men at entry level. And then as they go up through their leadership ranks, this is what they see. In every company I've ever worked for, you get a gradual drop-off of women and a gradual rise of men. Yep.
I see this type of graph, but I just would like to ask, why don't you see the sewage workers, construction workers, what are like 100% male-dominated? You only talking about like leadership position going up, but the really low-level positions are mostly male-dominated too.
Depends.
So like, from what I see in my private life, it's a Gauss curve, where like most of the female are in the middle, and on the both extremes of the curve are like more men. So it's like the females are like this, men are more like this.
So women are in the middle and men are at the bottom of the economic pyramid and at the top.
Both extremes have more men than women.
Both extremes have more, and the middle have more women. All different kinds of curves, absolutely. Depends on the sector that you're looking in. Healthcare, education, things like that are going to be very female-dominated at the bottom. What we're seeing increasingly is sectors are ghettoizing by gender, right? Some sectors and areas will be very male-dominated at the bottom. Other will be very female-dominated. So I'd argue with you on the bottom. But it is relevant across the board. But what is relevant, like countries, is who's leading the organization and creating the system into which talent is flowing. And what we're seeing is today's companies, like many countries, have allowed women in without really trying to adapt much of the system. They just thought, we're meritocracies, women are good, they're now educated, in they come, and we're going to try and treat everybody exactly the same, equal, fair, we're good places to work. But the reality actually looks like this, that the women drop off as you go into leadership, the men take off. And a lot of the debate for the last 20 years has been asking the question, so to what question are you asking? They look at this graph and they say, gosh, what's the matter with the poor women? Let's help them. And that's the frame we have been in for 30 years. Let's help these poor women, try and empower women to be more confident, to be more skilled, to be more assertive, to, well, can they sound a little bit more like men, and then maybe we can promote them. And that's what we've done. 20 years of well-meaning efforts to try and make those women a little bit more like men. And it doesn't work, because the result is we create women we don't like. Even the women who become these kind of alpha females don't like what they see in the mirror, and the men don't like them. And the next generation of young people coming up look at these women and say, oh my God, if that's what it takes to make it here, forget it, I'm out of here. The question we never ask when we look at this graph is, why is that line going up? What is it about one gender that seems to have a preference for self-replication? Different question. And if you ask a different question, you come to a completely different set of solutions. What if we actually started working with the dominant group and helping them adjust to the reality of today's talent and market? That would be interesting. And I'd suggest that's what we've been just starting to do for the last few years. You'll hear a lot of new words coming out, much more about inclusion, leadership skills, bilingual leadership. And we're leaving a little bit, I hope, behind this sort of thing. I can't put my finger on what it is we like about you, Miss Hardacre, but we do. Welcome aboard. And she's wearing a nice little male mask. As long as we're telling ourselves that our companies are nice, fair, meritocratic, healthy, wonderful places where women just have to perform in order to succeed, we're blinding ourselves to the reality that actually most corporate organizations are totally embedded in masculine norms, masculine systems, masculine realities, masculine career cycles, and until they adjust, we will never gender balance. It's a complete fixed system that will always identify one gender as superior to the others because it's unconscious of the differences between the two and is insisting that they treat everybody equally and the same. Every manager I've ever interviewed anywhere in the world will insist and believe that they are absolutely gender blind. I don't care if anybody's male, female, or one of the 52 other genders now on offer on Facebook. But gender blind may not be appropriate to a 21st century where 60% of your talent and 80% of your market might be female. In that case, the rise of women, I would argue, is like the rise of China. If you want to tap into Chinese talent, if you want to enter the Chinese market, you're going to learn everything you possibly can about the language and culture of the Chinese. Well, if you want to work with women, if you want to sell to women, if you want to connect with women, you might want to learn the language and culture of women. And if your organization is increasingly gender balanced, are you fully gender bilingual? Are you equally skilled and fluent in talking and connecting with 100% of your talent and 100% of your potential market? So gentlemen, just a quick question because I can't resist. How many of you would say, yes, I'm fully fluent in the language and culture of women? One brave soul. Two. Ladies, how many of you would say you're pretty fluent in the language and culture of men? Okay, very representative kind of vote. And then my question is that true? Are we framing this correctly? Is it true? Do women really understand men? And do men really not understand women at all? Is that a fallacy or is that a fact? So let me give you one more question that might answer it. Gentlemen, how many of you have spent most of your lives and careers in meetings, conferences, and boardrooms entirely dominated by women? One, that's why he's bilingual. Ladies, how many of you have spent most of your careers, meetings, conference time in rooms largely dominated by men? We are still growing up and living in very different worlds. And if we don't acknowledge the fact that a lot of men are largely unfamiliar with half the population they're now recruiting and serving, we're not going to give them the time and education and training they need in order to become gender bilingual. And that's where we're spending a lot of time. Yep.
Thank you very much, Avivah. I think you have a great sympathy in the audience and good support here. I just wanted to pick up on some of the things you said here at the end, like, because you're describing sort of a different kind of world, right? So if you simplify, there is a world, there is a couple of change needed that you have talked about, and now you're describing, in a sense, a gender bilingual world, or what we want to do. Could you give us a little bit more meat on the bone, so to say, on that? How will the world be different? And I'll keep it neutral in a sense. If we, as many of us want to do, go this way and work this way as you're doing. What's the main differences of the world we're living in?
What's the main differences of the world that we will live in when it's more gender balanced? It's hard to see. You can start looking around some of the countries and companies that are more gender balanced. So in the corporate world, we now know that companies that are more gender balanced in leadership are outperforming by most financial metrics. They have higher engagement scores. They have very different policies internally. And they're very different policy base in terms of how they understand and serve customers. So there's growth potential, there's performance potential, and there are very different mixes internally inside those companies in terms of who is actually running the place. I can go into more depth, but I just want to get to my last topic, which is couples, because it's part of the dilemma. I would also suggest it's going to address one of the other themes you're hearing more about. It's the whole idea of how people feel at work. The issues of stress and mental health, I think, are also very differently addressed in companies and countries that are more balanced on this front. But it takes will and skill from leaders, whether it's at a country or a company level. And I'd suggest today we're seeing a lot more will as the pressure grows, but there's still an issue of skill. Are leaders actually skilled at building gender bilingual organizations? And we're not giving them much time. So that's a lot of where we spend our time, is working with leaders to reframe actually what is the issue of gender balance and what is the opportunity for companies in there. The last chapter I don't want to neglect is the one of your own personal couple, which one of the people in my little trio was talking about. What happens to couples in a more gender balanced world? And a lot of men have been told for a long time that the person they marry will be a very crucial part of their career. But this is 100 times more true for women today. The man you marry, or the woman you marry, if you're going to go that route, is going to probably end up being the most important career choice of your life. Because basically women, I would suggest, only have two choices, especially if you're ambitious and successful. You can either have a super supportive spouse. I gave the example of Jacinda Ardern, the New Zealand Prime Minister, whose husband is a fully supportive, applauding kind of spouse. Or you can have no spouse at all. Elizabeth I comes to mind. Anything in between those two is a career and morale sapping mess, because you're constantly getting drained. And it's a challenge huge numbers of professional women feel, as men aren't yet used to being overshadowed, outspoken, or out-earned by women. And society around them judges men very harshly if that's their case. It's not yet very normal to have very gender-balanced couples. And bravo if you have. But it's emerging slowly, and we're seeing all kinds of new models coming out. We're leaving behind what was the dominant norm, a single earner couple, where the man usually traditionally had the dominant lead career and the wife just followed around the world, picking up his suitcase and children and moving. Or the lead career where one was a dominant career and one adjusted to it. And increasingly we're moving into a wonderful kaleidoscope of new forms if two people are ready to play. So alternators take turns, who's going to be the career. Parallelograms try and do two fast-track careers in parallel. Complements have two very different kinds of careers, like an entrepreneur and a corporate type. Mergers are increasingly seeing husbands and wives getting together to start companies. And sole players. We're seeing a growing number of people either choose to stay single or it happens to them because life goes that way. In certain women-unfriendly countries, Japan being an interesting example, you'll find huge numbers of women now refusing not only children, but marriage as well, because they have no choice. The men and societies in those cultures don't give them any choice to have a viable working life and couple. So I'll conclude with, behind every great man, we used to always say, was a wonderful woman. But increasingly, and to the benefit of both men and women, we're increasingly seeing the emergence of sort of power couples, where beside every great leader is another great leader. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.